the significant issues in early Australia was the place of freed convicts. This is a statue of Lachlan Macquarie. He was the Governor of New South Wales between 1810 and 1821. Lachlan Macquarie, with the influence of his wife and his own Christian faith, believed that convicts should be given a second chance. His Christian faith led him to believe in forgiveness, restoration and a fair go. And because of that, he emancipated, in other words, freed more convicts than any governor before him. Now, this caused enormous tension in the new colony. There were those who believed that there was a criminal class and they could never be given a second chance. But Lachlan Macquarie didn't believe that. And many of those he emancipated went on to serve Australia well. If you want to understand the genesis of a fair go for everyone, a key value in Australian society, look no further than Lachlan Macquarie, motivated by his Christian faith. It's another reason that faith runs deep in our country.
Lachlan and Elizabeth Macquarie were very committed Christian people. Elizabeth in particular had a very, very strong church background and had lived her, I suppose, important years through the evangelical sort of revival at the late 1700s and early 1800s, had a friend of William Wilberforce and all of that kind of thing. Deeply committed Christian. Lachlan was also a Christian. I think that the deepening of his Christian faith came as a result of his marriage to Elizabeth. But they came to Australia with Christian commitment to do what they considered to be right.
One of the greats in early Australian history that's talked about a lot is Lachlan Macquarie, but his wife Elizabeth was really significant. What's her background, especially a Christian background?
She had an interesting background. She was Scottish, and she also lived with a family, a clergy family in Devon for a while when she was a governess, and they were evangelicals. She started habits of daily Bible reading and prayer and Sabbath observance. And those things really she carried with her to the colony.
They were great underliners of their Bibles and their prayer books. They're great underliners. And in Lachlan Macquarie's prayer book, the Anglican prayer book, he underlined what we call the absolution, the announcement of that you are forgiven because God has forgiven you. If God does not desire the death of a sinner, but rather that the sinner be restored, how much more should we? He wrote, his last words that he ever wrote in his life was to write that. If the author of all that is desires not death but life, how much more we should desire not punishment but restoration.
Macquarie was very instrumental in appointing ex-convicts who'd done their time, who then took their place in the community. That was one of the great aspects of his governorship, and it got him into a lot of trouble. He was sacked, or he felt compelled to resign.
Yep.
Macquarie believed that once you'd served your sentence, you were free and should be allowed to live your life. But there were other people who had gone over to Australia, not as convicts, but as volunteers to try and set up a new life for themselves, usually through farming. And they didn't want to be in competition with criminals. It wasn't in their interest, so they wanted these people kept out of their way.
Macquarie had opened the gates And out of that flood of emancipated convicts came all of those people who made Australia how it is today.
I don't know where it comes from, but I just love London and I love old stuff. There is multiple connections with the Thames. You know, there's George, my great-great-grandfather, a convict in a hulk in Woolwich on the Thames. And there's his son, Edward, who becomes the champion sculler of the world on the Thames, on the Putney to Mortlake course in 1876. And now here's me scavenging along the foreshore of the Thames being a mudlark.
The closest I'll get to mudlarking is standing out of the mud and hoping that she's safe. But no, I won't be mudlarking with Jane. Steve, what do you know about the first mudlarks?
A lot of people lived along rivers like the Thames, and the Thames, you know, now it's pretty empty, but 200 years ago it would have been a major thoroughfare full of traffic boats, you know, taking people and taking goods from all around the world in the UK. And so a lot of stuff would fall into the river and either wash up on the shore or be buried in the mud. So, you know, if you had no other option, it was a way to make a living, digging about in the mud and finding stuff that had been dropped or lost.
Wow. So it wasn't a craft activity. It was a bit of an opportunity for survival.
It wasn't really a lifestyle thing. No, it was a way of trying to make a living.
I'd love to find a piece of blue and white pottery. A bigger piece than what I've got now.
They're just all different shapes and colours and sizes, just broken pieces you can see. It's just amazing to think who last touched these things.
So my family history is the Trickett line. My great-great-grandfather as a convict, he was sentenced initially to death by hanging. A chaplain interceded on behalf of 12 men in that jail to have their sentence of hanging commuted to transportation for life. And so I look back now and I think, wow, you know, if it was not for that chaplain interceding on his behalf, you know, our family line would have finished right there and then.
It's not that the Trickett family had this sort of wonderful, you know, dynasty of faith. It's almost like God intervening in particular people's lives, which made a difference in the future. We often focus on the kind of male leaders like the Richard Burkes, the Lachlan Macquaries, you know, leaders like MacArthur in the wool industry. They all had wives that were deeply influential.
Oh, absolutely. And women in the history of evangelicalism are sort of, in many ways, the great, well, in the history of Christianity are often the unsung heroes. Although in evangelicalism, women seem to have had a greater influence. Women have just had a massive influence in constructing civil society in Australia.
So how did Mary Reevey come to Australia?
Well, she came as a convict, and it was an amazing story, actually. She was convicted of horse stealing in 1790. When she was arrested, she was dressed up as a boy named James Burrow. And it wasn't until after her trial, under medical examination, that they discovered that she was actually a girl.
So when was Mary emancipated?
She was emancipated 2 years after she arrived, when she married. So Thomas Reevey had met her down on the docks. He was an employee of the East India Company. He was an Irishman, and they married in 1794. And at that point, she was emancipated, and he was given land, and they settled on the Hawkesbury River and farmed there for some time.
He was a successful businessman, wasn't he?
He was, yes. He started a cargo business along the Hawkesbury and then later in Sydney, and he became quite successful by the time of his death in 1811. So she was left with 7 children, and then the business as well. His business partner had actually died within months of him, so she was left with the whole thing. And she really thrived and succeeded in business herself, but she managed to not just run it, she expanded it as well.
What were some of the driving values for Mary?
She wrote in her diary about the sermons she listened to, some key verses that she loved, and I think her values also involved a lot of generosity as well, which came from her Christian faith.
Is there a way of looking at her legacy all these years later?
I think she's interesting for 2 reasons. One, she represents the many emancipists who really benefited from the generosity of Lachlan and Elizabeth Macquarie. And I think also we can see her legacy in the institutions that she supported, the way that she not just made money, but she contributed to the economy in Sydney. She built buildings, and she supported these public institutions which were emerging at the time.
My parents were not practicing Christians in any meaningful sense of the word. I suppose you'd call us nominal or cultural Christians. I was baptised and I was sent to Sunday school. I didn't mind it, but it didn't grab me. Put it that way. I didn't go on with it as a teenager.
So as soon as you had the opportunity to stop, you did.
Yes. Yes.
What did you go on to study, Roy?
Well, I did pretty well at school, and I studied law at Sydney University.
If we met you in your kind of law study years,
yes,
what was faith like then for you?
Well, I didn't have any. I was, looking back, I was terribly ignorant of Christianity and religion in general. As I said, I'd come from a well-educated background on many other things. So I would have liked to have said I was very well informed about many things. I certainly knew the law well. But I didn't have a good grounding in the most important questions of all.
Yeah.
And that was so until my mid-30s. I became increasingly unhappy without quite realising why.
What did unhappiness look like? Did you just feel glum?
I dreaded waking up in the morning. It was subsequently diagnosed as mental illness. But I like to think of it now as a warning, as a providential warning from God. I really do see it that way.
Yeah. Richard Johnson was the first chaplain. He was followed by Samuel Marsden. Tell us about Samuel Marsden.
Who was a man of big vision, big personality and big stature as well. In fact, they say, look, he was built like an ox. But he came and assisted Johnson for a while and then took over as the principal chaplain. He was here until he died in 1835.
One of his main contributions to the colony was in agriculture, actually. He was one of the best farmers in the whole of New South Wales.
He had 27 farms, 27 properties. He had a very considerable holding and, of course, was responsible for getting wool transported to England. He was in it for the challenge because these Christians believed that if you had prosperous industry, then people would be likely to prosper. The best thing to do for convicts was to give them a job.
Yeah.
And that's what they did.
Look, he's got a mixed reputation, it must be said. He's been decimated over the years by the secular historians. The flogging parson, of course, is his nickname, because as well as his duties as a Church of England minister, he was a magistrate.
So there's a lot of myths about Marsden on the Australian side that have caused us to look back on him as if he was a negative character, overshadowing the many positive things that he did. So because of his mission to serve Christ in this land and in the South Seas, he recruited clergy and missionaries with that same vision and perspective, and ordinary people, settlers who had come who shared those evangelical convictions and the mission to build Australia.
New South Wales Governor Richard Bourke instituted the 1836 Church Act. It was to encourage the building of churches because he believed that was good for society. We're in Armidale. It's in the New England district in the northern part of New South Wales. And this beautiful space is Central Park. And Central Park is surrounded by huge churches. Behind me is St. Peter's Cathedral, and it was completed in 1875. Over this side is St. Paul's Presbyterian Church, completed in 1882. And on this side is St. Mary's Catholic Cathedral, completed in 1912. Here are three huge churches in a regional city completed within 40 years of each other. They are a physical representation of the influence of the Christian church. Now, this goes way beyond just Christian heritage. This is about deep influence. And at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, the church had a great influence across this country. It may be diminished today, but it still exists. Going forward to another governor, Richard Bourke, he started the 1836 Church Act, which most people don't know about. What was the 1836 Church Act?
It was an act of Parliament, very controversial at the time, that established the principle that in New South Wales, all of the Christian denominations would be treated equally.
Bourke was deeply concerned that if we didn't build more churches in Australia, that Australia would fall into godlessness. And he also believed that the Church of England should not be the privileged church in New South Wales in the way that it was in England. And so the Church Act basically apportioned money to pay for churches for the Church of England, Catholics, Presbyterians, and eventually Wesleyan Methodists.
He said, we the government, we will give to every community of Christians who can identify as a distinct group. We'll give you £1,000 to establish a church, and we'll pay you £200 a year for your minister, at a time when the average wage was about £100. So this was very generous.
What it actually did was create a plural establishment where you had 4 churches given state funding, and the purpose of it was to Christianise Australia. He believed very strongly in the Protestant faith. He himself was a very pious Anglican. But he also believed that one of the things that was the greatest threat to Christianity was Christians persecuting other Christians. And he really wanted to try to get rid of all the sectarian or the fights between the denominations by basically giving them all money.
So how many churches took up this opportunity of the Church Act?
Most towns in Australia took up this opportunity, which is why when you go into old towns today, you can drive through and you'll see, an Anglican church, a Presbyterian church, a Methodist church, and a Catholic church. Chances are they were built under the Church Act.
One of the greats of that period was J.D. Lang. Who was J.D. Lang?
J.D. Lang was the founder of Presbyterianism in Australia. Bulletin magazine, in its centenary issue in 1888, surveyed the history of the first 100 years, and even though it was a deeply anti-clerical magazine, critical of the churches, nominated Lang as the most influential figure. But Lang, more than that, was a dominant figure publicly. He was a strange mixture of what we now call deep social conservatism on issues of morality and public behaviour and so forth, but progressivism on issues of economic equality and human rights.
He would go over with samples of Australian cotton and say that, and show that they were some of the best in the world. And his motive for that was actually try to undermine the slave industry in America. He thought that if we could produce cotton as good as American cotton with much cheaper labour, that would destroy the slave industry in America, and he would be able to see the end of slavery in his lifetime.
When my older daughter, Hope, was 4 years old, I decided one Sunday morning that I was going to take her down to Sunday school. I had this image of dropping her at the door and having a free Sunday morning. The local Presbyterian church that I took her to greeted us very warmly, but they said, look, we really don't like parents just to ditch their kid at the door and treat us as some sort of babysitting service. So one of you really has to stay, and I did. Now, I started off in the first few weeks just sitting in the back of the pew and half listening to what was going on, but I actually dipped into the Bible in the pew. And very, very quickly I got interested. I got interested intellectually. Later, I also came to enjoy the fellowship of the church, but for me, it was an initial realisation that there was so much I didn't know.
Okay.
And these were the deepest questions of all that I'd never really properly thought about.
Did that surprise you?
Yeah, it did. And how could I have got this far in my life without truly turning my mind to, is there a creator God? If so, what does that God require of me? So being the sort of guy I am, I started to read voraciously apologetics, and the minister pointed me in good directions, and I just started to nut it out for myself.
At what point did you get to saying, gosh, this is true and I need to make a response?
It was within 12 months. I started sobbing and during the singing of a hymn about the crucifixion, and I hadn't cried since childhood, and I hadn't cried since. And many might say, well, so what? But of course, for the individual, it's all about the timing of such an experience and a response to, in my case, an understanding of the meaning of the cross for the first time at an emotional level, spiritual level. Yeah.
Isn't that intriguing that you spent all that time thinking about it intellectually, but then in this, hymn on Good Friday, when the church celebrates the death of Jesus, that actually came home personally?
It did. I mean, the skeptics would say, well, you were ill. But that doesn't begin to explain the context and God's purposes in making you aware that you are ill and what's lacking in your life and so on.
I would have described my family of origin as a church-going family for a lot of the years that I was growing up. My parents never missed a Sunday. My dad, expressed his faith through his works. He was serving the church in any way he could. And Mum was in the choir. She had a great voice and she was very involved in that. But I don't think that faith was personal then. I would say that we were a church-going family, but that faith wasn't personal. We had this weekend of mission where we had evangelistic speaking. My dad was possibly even on sound, so he was up in the sound booth at the back of the church. And by that stage, my heart had already been really touched and I was sort of full on for God at that point. And I'm sitting in the choir and watching this preacher, and then at the end of it, he asked anyone to come forward that, wanted to commit their life to Jesus. And then I see my dad, all 6'3" of him, walk down the aisle towards the front. And my dad had been like an elder of the church. He'd served the church for his whole life. And this was his personal commitment. Like, it was amazing, beautiful.